Solve this and I'll give you $100 million. The billionaire laughed as he tapped the screen behind him, and the sound of that laughter rolled across the ballroom like it already owned the room. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over polished marble floors. Glasses clinked softly. Investors in tailored suits leaned back in leather chairs worth more than some people's monthly rent. Outside the towering windows of the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago, the city glittered beneath a cool autumn sky, but inside, every eye was fixed on the equation glowing across a 40-foot LED display. Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of it all. 39 years old, founder and CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, a man whose name appeared on magazine covers, business channels, and billionaire rankings. He looked perfectly comfortable under the spotlight. Why wouldn't he? He had built a technology empire valued at nearly $80 billion. Winning was not something he hoped for. It was something he expected. Ethan crossed his arms and looked at the crowd with the confidence of someone who had never been told no for very long. 5 minutes, he said. That's all I'm giving you. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. The challenge was supposed to be entertainment. Clever puzzle. A display of intellect for the wealthy elite gathered at the annual Whitmore Innovation Gala. Hundreds of executives, venture capitalists, and tech founders had come to network beneath the glow of prestige and ambition. Yet now they stared at the screen as if it were written in another language. Some narrowed their eyes. Others pulled out phones. A few whispered theories to the people beside them. None looked confident. Ethan seemed pleased by that. Very pleased. He slowly paced the stage, enjoying the silence that followed. Come on, he teased. You're supposed to be the smartest people in America. More laughter, more smiles. But beneath the humor was something sharper, something competitive. Nobody wanted to fail publicly in a room filled with power. Near the back of the ballroom, moving quietly between tables with a silver tray balanced against her palm, Amara Johnson watched without appearing to watch. Her black uniform blended into the background. Her name tag reflected the chandelier light whenever she passed beneath it. To most people in the room, she was invisible. Just another waitress refilling sparkling water and collecting empty glasses. Another person serving the evening rather than participating in it. That was how these events usually worked. The wealthy occupied the spotlight. Everyone else moved around its edges. Amara stopped briefly beside a table where 3 investors debated the equation in hushed voices. She set down fresh glasses, offered a polite smile, and continued walking. Nobody asked her opinion. Nobody imagined she might have one. On stage, Ethan checked his watch and smirked. 3 minutes left, he announced. A groan moved through the audience. One executive shook his head and surrendered. Another laughed nervously. The puzzle remained unsolved. The billionaire's smile widened. He was enjoying every second. Then his gaze drifted across the ballroom, across the tables, across the investors, across the servers. And finally, for reasons nobody could yet understand, it landed on Amara Johnson. Amara lowered her eyes and continued toward the next table as if nothing unusual had happened. But she could still feel Ethan Whitmore's gaze lingering for a second longer than expected. Then it was gone. The billionaire returned his attention to the audience, and the room resumed its rhythm of quiet conversations, nervous laughter, and expensive confidence. For Amara, however, the evening was far from glamorous. Her shift had started nearly 9 hours earlier. The polished ballroom, the designer suits, the million-dollar smiles. None of it changed the ache in her feet or the exhaustion sitting behind her eyes. She moved carefully between tables carrying a tray filled with sparkling water, making sure not to interrupt conversations worth more money than she would probably earn in a lifetime. A guest snapped his fingers without looking at her. Another pointed at an empty glass. A third asked for extra ice and immediately turned away before she could answer. Amara responded to each request with the same calm professionalism. She had learned long ago that dignity did not depend on how people treated you. It depended on how you carried yourself when they did. Earlier that morning, she had left her apartment before sunrise. The elevator in her building had been broken again, forcing her to walk down 6 flights of stairs. Before heading to work, She stopped at a pharmacy to pick up medication for her mother. The cost had gone up again. Everything seemed to cost more lately. Rent, groceries, utilities. Even hope felt expensive sometimes. Yet she never complained. There was no audience for struggle. No standing ovation for sacrifice. Life simply expected you to keep moving. And Amara did. Most people at the hotel knew very little about her. They knew she arrived early. They knew she covered extra shifts when someone called out sick. They knew she never raised her voice and rarely joined workplace gossip. What they did not know was that every night after work she spent hours reading. Mathematics, logic, engineering, anything she could find online or borrow from the public library. Her small apartment was filled with notebooks stacked beside old textbooks purchased secondhand. Knowledge had become her private companion, something nobody could take away from her. Not circumstance, not disappointment, not time. Back inside the ballroom, the countdown continued. 1 minute remaining. Ethan's challenge still sat untouched on the giant screen. Several executives had already given up. One billionaire investor jokingly blamed the hotel lighting. Another claimed he was too tired to think. The excuses drew polite laughter, but nobody looked comfortable. Failure was unfamiliar territory for people accustomed to success. Ethan seemed energized by it. He stood beneath the glow of the display like a conductor directing an orchestra of frustration. 30 seconds, he announced. Groans echoed through the room. Amara passed near the stage carrying a fresh tray of glasses. For a brief moment her eyes drifted toward the equation. Just a glance. Nothing more. But something caught her attention immediately. A small detail. A hidden assumption buried deep inside the logic. Her pace slowed. The tray remained steady in her hands. Around her, nobody noticed. Investors continued debating. Phones remained raised. The room stayed focused on Ethan Whitmore. Yet Amara saw something that everyone else had missed. She looked away and kept walking. The equation lingered in her mind anyway. Not because it was impossible. Quite the opposite. The more she considered it, the more a quiet realization formed. The challenge was not unsolvable. The challenge was wrong. The final seconds disappeared from the countdown clock, and a soft chime echoed through the ballroom. Nobody had produced an answer. Nobody had even come close. The massive screen continued glowing above the stage, its symbols and numbers shining against the dark backdrop like a challenge directed at every ambitious person in the room. Ethan Whitmore spread his hands and smiled. The audience responded with scattered laughter and polite applause. Some people laughed at themselves. Others laughed because everyone else was laughing. A few simply looked relieved that the pressure was over. "Well," Ethan said, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit. "Either I overestimated this room or underestimated the problem." More laughter followed. The billionaire knew how to control an audience. Every word landed exactly where he wanted it to. Around the ballroom, conversations immediately shifted into postmortems. Executives debated possible solutions. Investors defended failed approaches. One startup founder insisted he had almost solved it. Another blamed the time limit. The room became filled with confident explanations from people who had no answer. Amara listened quietly while collecting empty glasses from a nearby table. She heard fragments of conversations as she moved. The variable cannot be isolated. The sequence breaks in the third line. There is missing information. It is impossible. The word impossible appeared again and again. Yet every time she heard it, the same thought returned to her mind. The challenge was not impossible. The challenge was built on a mistake. She stopped briefly beside a table occupied by several venture capital executives. One of them pointed toward the screen and shook his head. "Whoever solves that deserves the 100 million. Another laughed and replied, "Maybe one of the servers can do it." The table erupted with amusement. Not cruel laughter exactly. Just the casual kind people use when they are convinced something is absurd. Nobody expected a waitress to understand a problem that had defeated some of the most successful business minds in America. Amara kept her expression calm and continued working. She had heard versions of that assumption her entire life. Sometimes people looked at your uniform and decided they already knew your limits. Sometimes they looked at your paycheck and assumed it measured your intelligence. Sometimes they never looked at you at all. On stage, Ethan glanced toward the audience and appeared ready to move on to the next event. The challenge had served its purpose. It had entertained the crowd. It had reminded everyone who controlled the room. Then a guest near the front raised his glass and shouted jokingly, "Come on, Ethan, give somebody another chance." Several people cheered in agreement. Ethan laughed. "Fine," he said. "One more chance. Anyone brave enough to embarrass themselves in front of 600 people?" The crowd responded with playful groans. Nobody moved. Nobody volunteered. Why would they? Failure in private was one thing. Failure under chandeliers and cameras was another. Ethan scanned the room dramatically. His eyes moved across rows of tables and expensive suits before drifting toward the staff working the perimeter of the ballroom. Then he smiled. Not because he expected anything remarkable. Quite the opposite. He pointed casually toward Amara. "What about you?" he called out. Heads turned immediately. Conversations stopped. For a moment the ballroom seemed to inhale all at once. Amara stood frozen beside a table, a tray balanced against her hip. A few guests chuckled. Someone whispered, "This should be interesting." Ethan leaned lightly against the podium. "Would you like to take a shot at it?" The question sounded playful. The audience expected her to laugh and decline. They expected the moment to become another joke. Instead, Amara looked up at the glowing equation one more time. Then she looked directly at Ethan Whitmore and said with complete calm, "I could solve it. But first, I would need to explain why it is wrong." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. The laughter vanished first. Then the whispers. Then even the faint clinking of glasses seemed to fade beneath the weight of what Amara had just said. Ethan Whitmore stared at her from the stage. His expression caught somewhere between amusement and curiosity. The room had expected embarrassment. It had expected a polite refusal. What it received instead was confidence. Calm, measured confidence. The kind that does not ask for attention because it does not need it. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "The problem is wrong?" he repeated. A few guests exchanged skeptical looks. Others smirked. One executive near the front quietly chuckled and shook his head. The equation had been reviewed by some of the brightest analysts inside Whitmore Dynamics. It had been tested repeatedly before appearing on that screen. The suggestion that a waitress had spotted a flaw in less than a minute sounded impossible. Yet Amara did not appear nervous. She did not rush to defend herself. She simply stood there holding her tray as if she had commented on the weather. That composure unsettled people more than any argument could have. Ethan stepped away from the podium and folded his arms. "Interesting," he said. "Then tell us what everyone else missed." Several cameras immediately lifted. Guests who had been checking messages returned their attention to the stage. Across the ballroom, phones quietly switched into recording mode. Not because anyone expected history. They expected entertainment. They expected a mistake. Amara slowly placed her tray onto a nearby service station. Every eye followed her. The distance between the back of the ballroom and the stage was less than 50 feet, yet it suddenly felt much longer. She walked calmly beneath the chandeliers while hundreds of wealthy strangers watched her every step. Some smiled politely. Some looked doubtful. Others looked openly amused. But Amara kept moving. She reached the front and turned toward the giant display. The equation filled the screen behind her. Rows of symbols, variables, assumptions, conditions. She studied it silently for several seconds. Then she pointed toward a single line near the center. "Right here," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the microphone carried every word through the room. The fourth assumption contradicts the second condition. Confused murmurs immediately spread through the audience. Ethan glanced toward the display. One of his senior engineers sitting near the front narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. Amara continued, The equation assumes a value can remain constant while also responding dynamically to the variable introduced earlier. Both conditions cannot be true at the same time. The engineer's expression changed first. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes. Then he looked back at the screen, then back at Amara. Around him, other technical specialists began studying the equation again. Not casually this time, carefully. The room was changing. The confidence that had filled it only minutes earlier was beginning to crack. Ethan's smile faded. Not entirely. Just enough to reveal concentration beneath it. For the first time all evening, he was no longer looking at Amara as a participant in a joke. He was listening. The engineer stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward a few inches across the polished floor. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward him. For nearly 10 seconds he said nothing. He simply stared at the equation, then at Amara, then back at the screen. The silence carried more weight than any speech could have. Finally he adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. She is correct. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread through the ballroom instantly. Conversations erupted. Heads turned. Phones lifted higher. Several guests who had barely paid attention to the waitress moments earlier now watched her with undisguised curiosity. Ethan Whitmore remained motionless. His expression revealed little, but the room could feel the shift. Something unexpected had happened. The challenge was no longer a performance controlled entirely by the billionaire. Amara pointed once more toward the display. If that assumption is corrected, the entire structure changes, she explained calmly. The equation becomes solvable because the contradiction disappears. A senior analyst near the front quickly opened a tablet and began working through the logic. Another joined him, then another. The ballroom transformed into a room full of people trying to catch up with someone they had overlooked. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the giant screen. He studied the section Amara had identified. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a showman and more like an engineer. The version of himself that had built a company instead of merely leading one. Go on, he said. His voice was quieter now. The audience noticed. Amara nodded. She accepted a marker from one of the event staff and approached a digital writing panel connected to the display. A few guests exchanged amused smiles, still expecting the moment to collapse. Surely identifying a flaw was easier than solving the problem. Surely this was where confidence would meet reality. But Amara began writing. One step, then another. Every line followed naturally from the last. No hesitation. No dramatic pauses. She moved with the certainty of someone walking a familiar path. The room grew quieter with every equation that appeared. The analyst with the tablet stopped typing and simply watched. Two venture capitalists who had been whispering earlier fell completely silent. Even the servers standing near the ballroom entrance seemed frozen. Amara was not performing. She was thinking, and that difference changed everything. Ethan watched each step carefully. At one point he crossed his arms. At another he lowered them. Small details but revealing ones. He was testing her reasoning as she went. Looking for mistakes. Looking for shortcuts. Looking for any sign that luck had brought her this far. He found none. The solution continued unfolding with elegant precision. Then Amara reached the final line. She set down the marker and stepped back. The answer glowed across the massive screen. No fanfare, no celebration, just a result. For a long moment nobody spoke. The ballroom stood suspended between disbelief and understanding. Somewhere in the crowd a guest whispered, "There is no way." Another replied, "Check it." But Ethan Whitmore was already doing exactly that. And as his eyes moved through the solution line by line, something unusual happened. The confidence that had filled the room all night began gathering around a different person entirely. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. It was not the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of realization. Ethan Whitmore remained focused on the screen while several members of his technical team worked independently through the solution. One by one, their expressions changed. A raised eyebrow, a slow nod, a glance toward Amara. The pattern repeated across the front rows. Nobody wanted to speak too soon. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit what was becoming increasingly obvious. Finally, the senior analyst lowered his tablet onto the table and leaned back in his chair. The movement seemed small, yet it carried the weight of a verdict. "The solution is valid," he said quietly. The microphone near his table caught every word. A murmur swept through the ballroom. Then another analyst confirmed it. Then a third. What had started as skepticism was transforming into something else entirely. Respect. Ethan looked up from the screen. For a moment he simply studied Amara Johnson. The waitress standing beneath the giant display no longer appeared invisible. In fact, she had become the center of gravity inside a room filled with powerful people. Cameras remained pointed toward her. Investors who had barely noticed her an hour earlier now watched with complete attention. Some looked impressed. Others looked stunned. A few appeared uncomfortable. Not because she had succeeded, but because they had been so certain she would fail. Ethan took a slow breath. "How long did it take you to see the flaw?" he asked. Amara considered the question. "A few seconds," she replied honestly. Laughter almost escaped from several guests before they realized she was serious. Ethan noticed that too. "A few seconds?" he repeated. "You are telling me that hundreds of executives missed something you saw while serving tables?" Amara glanced around the ballroom. Crystal lights reflected across polished glass and silverware. The room looked exactly as it had before. Yet somehow everything felt different. "People usually find what they expect to find," she said. "When everyone assumes something is correct, they stop checking whether it is." The answer landed harder than anyone anticipated. Not because it was clever, because it was true. Across the audience, heads nodded slowly. Some guests looked down. Others smiled with reluctant admiration. Ethan found himself smiling as well. Not the confident smile he had worn all evening. A different one. Smaller. More genuine. "That is a dangerous observation," he said. "Especially in business." Amara shrugged lightly. "It is dangerous everywhere." The ballroom responded with quiet laughter. This time the laughter belonged to her. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Then a voice emerged from one of the front tables. An older man with silver hair stood up slowly. He had remained silent throughout most of the evening. Yet the moment Amara saw him, something flickered across her face. Recognition. The man stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "Amara Johnson?" he asked. She froze. The room noticed immediately. The man stepped away from his chair, disbelief written across his face. "That is impossible," he murmured. "I know that name." Suddenly the attention of the ballroom intensified once again. Because whatever story people thought they were witnessing had just become much bigger. The older man took another step forward, and suddenly the confidence of a room full of billionaires seemed less important than the look in his eyes. He was Professor Leonard Graves, a name recognized throughout academic circles, a mathematician whose research had influenced universities across the country. Even people who could not understand his work knew his reputation. Ethan Whitmore certainly did. Several guests immediately turned toward him. "Professor Graves?" Ethan asked. "You know her?" The professor let out a slow breath. "Know her?" he repeated. 10 years ago, every major mathematics department in America knew her name. A wave of confusion moved through the ballroom. Cameras shifted from Amara to the professor and back again. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Professor Graves looked directly at Amara. "You were 17 when you won the National Mathematical Futures competition." The room remained silent. "You solved a problem that graduate students could not solve. You became the youngest participant ever invited to the Advanced Research Institute summer program." Several guests blinked in surprise. Others exchanged puzzled looks. This was not the story they expected from a hotel waitress. Professor Graves continued. 3 universities offered you full scholarships before you graduated high school. MIT, Stanford, Caltech. The names landed heavily in the room. Amara lowered her eyes briefly. Not out of shame. Out of memory. Some chapters of life become difficult to revisit, even when they are extraordinary. Ethan looked from the professor to Amara. "You never attended?" he asked quietly. The professor answered before she could. "No." She disappeared. The ballroom seemed to lean forward collectively. The mystery had become impossible to ignore. Professor Graves softened his voice. "I tried to find you. Many people did." Amara smiled faintly. It was not the smile of someone remembering success. It was the smile of someone remembering sacrifice. "My mother became ill," she said. "Very ill." The room grew still once more. The treatments were expensive. "My younger brother was 12. Someone had to work." No dramatic music could have added more weight than the simplicity of those words. Someone had to work. She did not describe hardship. She did not ask for sympathy. She stated a fact. The professor nodded slowly. "You walked away from opportunities people spend their entire lives chasing." Amara looked around the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Wealth and influence surrounded her from every direction. Yet her answer remained calm. Family came first. For several seconds nobody responded. Not because they disagreed. Because they understood. Some investors lowered their eyes. A few guests quietly placed their phones down. The story had stopped being about mathematics. It had become something deeper. Ethan Whitmore studied Amara with an expression nobody had seen from him all evening. Respect. Genuine respect. Then the professor smiled. "I knew I recognized the way you approached the problem. I spent months showing your competition solution to my graduate students." A ripple of astonishment swept through the audience. The waitress standing before them was not an unknown genius discovered by accident. She had been extraordinary all along. The only difference was that nobody in the ballroom had bothered to ask who she was before tonight. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed so completely that it felt like a different event. An hour earlier, the guests had arrived expecting another celebration of wealth, innovation, and influence. Now they were witnessing something none of them had planned for. The story of the evening no longer belonged to the billionaire host. It belonged to the woman standing quietly beside the screen. Phones remained raised throughout the room. Some guests were recording openly now. Others were already sending messages to colleagues, friends, and social media contacts. The clips were spreading beyond the ballroom walls before the event had even ended. A venture capitalist near the front refreshed his phone and stared at the screen in disbelief. One short video of Amara explaining the flaw in the equation had already collected thousands of views. Another guest laughed softly and showed her screen to the people beside her. The comments were arriving faster than anyone could read them. Who is she? How did nobody know about her? The waitress solved it? Across the room, conversations blended into a low wave of astonishment. Yet at the center of it all, Amara remained remarkably calm. She did not check a phone. She did not celebrate. She did not appear interested in the sudden attention surrounding her. That quiet confidence only made people admire her more. Ethan Whitmore noticed it too. Many people chased recognition. Many people built entire careers around being noticed. Amara had achieved in 10 minutes what others spent decades pursuing, and she seemed completely unmoved by it. Ethan found that fascinating. One of the senior executives from Whitmore Dynamics approached the stage carrying a tablet. He handed it to Ethan and whispered something into his ear. The billionaire studied the screen for several moments. Then he nodded slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced. The room immediately fell silent. "My team has independently verified every step of the solution." A fresh wave of applause erupted. This time it was louder, longer, more genuine. Amara stood beneath the chandeliers while hundreds of people applauded her achievement. Some guests even rose to their feet. Others quickly followed. Within seconds, much of the ballroom was standing. The ovation echoed against the marble walls and soaring ceilings. Yet the most remarkable reaction came from Ethan himself. He walked toward the center of the stage and stopped directly in front of her. For most of the evening, he had been the unquestioned authority in the room. The person everyone watched. The person everyone listened to. Now he looked at Amara Johnson with something far more valuable than admiration. He looked at her with humility. "I built this challenge to identify exceptional thinking," he said. Apparently, exceptional thinking was serving drinks tonight. The audience laughed warmly. Ethan smiled and continued. "And if I am being honest, I nearly made the same mistake everyone else did. I saw a uniform before I saw a person." The admission surprised the room. Powerful people rarely spoke that honestly in public. Yet nobody doubted his sincerity, because the evidence was standing right beside him. The applause slowly faded. The cameras remained fixed on the stage. Every guest sensed that the most important moment of the night was still coming. Ethan Whitmore glanced toward the giant display one final time, then back at Amara. The promise he had made earlier still hung in the air, waiting to be addressed. The ballroom became so quiet that even the distant hum of the city beyond the glass windows seemed louder than before. Ethan Whitmore looked at Amara Johnson and then toward the audience that had witnessed the entire evening unfold. The challenge, the mistake, the solution, the revelation. Every step had led to this moment. "A promise is a promise," Ethan said. "The award stands." A ripple of anticipation moved through the room. $100 million. The number itself seemed almost unreal. Some guests smiled. Others nodded approvingly. A few began applauding again before Ethan had even finished speaking. But Amara did not react. She simply stood there, calm as ever. Ethan noticed. Everyone noticed. "You do understand what I am offering?" he asked with a faint smile. "Yes," Amara replied. "I do." "And?" Ethan asked. The room leaned forward. Cameras remained raised. Hundreds of people waited for her answer. Amara glanced around the ballroom. She looked at the investors, the executives, the entrepreneurs, the servers standing quietly near the walls. Then she spoke. Tonight was never about the money. The applause stopped. Not because people disagreed, because they wanted to hear every word. "Money helps people," she continued. "It pays bills, creates opportunities, it solves many problems. But the most important thing that happened tonight cannot be deposited into a bank account." Ethan remained silent. Amara looked toward the giant screen where the solved equation still glowed. "For years, people assumed they knew my value before they knew my story. Sometimes because of my job. Sometimes because of my circumstances. Sometimes because they never asked." The room listened carefully. "That happens to many people every day. Not just me." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded slowly. The message had reached them. "Tonight, people did not change their minds because I needed respect," Amara said. "They changed their minds because they finally paid attention." A long silence followed. It was the kind of silence that only truth can create. Ethan Whitmore smiled. Not the smile of a billionaire making headlines. The smile of a man learning something valuable. "Then what do you want?" he asked. Amara thought for a moment. "Opportunity," she answered. "Not just for me. For people whose talent is hidden behind circumstances." The applause returned instantly, louder than before, stronger than before. Many guests rose to their feet again. This time the standing ovation was not for a mathematical solution. It was for an idea. Ethan extended his hand. Amara shook it. "Then let us build something worthwhile," he said. Months later, clips from that evening would still circulate across the country. News outlets would cover the story. Universities would reach out. Scholarships would be created. Opportunities would emerge. But the moment people remembered most was not the challenge itself. It was the lesson hidden inside it. Because on a night filled with wealth, prestige, and power, the smartest person in the room was the one nobody had bothered to notice. He had the money. She had the mind. And that night, intelligence wore an apron.